Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today we're going to have another what if, another thought exercise, and we're going to try and imagine how comics might have been different. What if Neal Adams had stayed at Archie Comics? That's right, Archie Comics. So, in a weird way, this is actually a sequel to a previous What If that I did. You may remember a while ago I did a thing, What If Jack Kirby had stayed working at Archie on the fly? Because in 1958, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon launched a line of superhero books at Archie Comics a couple years before Marvel did, but Kirby only stayed working on the fly for like 4 issues. They also did another superhero book there, one of his patriotic heroes, but then he left to work at Marvel. So in that video, I talked about how it might have been different if Jack Kirby had put his ideas instead of into the Marvel universe, if he had put them into the Archie superhero universe. But today we're going to have a different take on this, a different look at this, because what some people may not know is that Neal Adams also got his start working on the fly at Archie Comics. I was inspired to do this because on one of the forums I'm on, a Classic Comics forum, they were talking about people that you don't realize, how young or how old they are in terms of creators. And someone had mentioned, you think of Neal Adams as being a Bronze Age guy, but he started at DC around late 66 into 67. And so he's really a Silver Age guy because he also did all the late Silver Age stuff at Marvel and X-Men and stuff like that. But actually, he started his career, what a lot of people don't know, he started much earlier at Archie Comics in 1959. And what happened was this. It was the fly, because Jack Kirby did leave to go to Marvel, and so Archie needed other people working on the fly. Now, Joe Simon stayed on the book, but they were looking for artists to fill the role of the fly artist because Jack Kirby was gone. And in 1959, one of the young artists who tried out and did sample pages for Archie to try out for the artist of the fly was none other than Neal Adams. And my understanding is that what happened was Joe Simon didn't like it. And so Adams only ended up getting one single panel published in an issue of The Fly. Whoever was working on the book at the time, they didn't like a certain thing that he had done in it, but they liked better what Neal Adams had done, so they cut a single panel out of Neal Adams's tryout samples and replaced the panel in the comic with that. And so he had one panel published in The Fly. Now, he did end up getting other work for Archie. Even though Joe Simon wasn't interested in having all the superhero books, Neal Adams ended up in 1960 doing several issues of Archie's joke book. And then he had some kind of falling out with the editors at Archie. He ended up leaving and he went into comic strips for several years, working in the newspapers up until 1966. And that's when he got back into comics. But Neal Adams originally was trying to break in on The Fly. And so that got me thinking, how different could things have been if Joe Simon had recognized the incredible talent in Neal Adams and given him the job of taking over for Jack Kirby on The Fly in 1959. And it's interesting because, when we're talking about Jack Kirby being on The Fly and instead of going to Marvel, it completely changes everything in terms of the characters being created, the universe being created, and the whole direction of the comic book industry. Because if you don't have that Marvel revival, who knows what happens? I think if Neal Adams stays at Archie, we have a different effect, because we'll still have Kirby over at Marvel and the Marvel Revolution happening, right? But simultaneous to that, we'll have Neal Adams exploring and creating his signature realism style of superhero comics almost a full decade before he got famous for doing that. His early work on Deadman in 1967 is when people really started to foresee this hyper-realistic type of superhero work, which is so different from what Kirby's doing. But now imagine if Neal Adams is already doing that work in 1961 at the same time that Kirby is doing the Marvel Universe. How different do you think viewers, readers are going to look at things like the Justice League in 1960 and Spider-Man in 1962 with Steve Ditko's art if instead of being used to those styles or the house style of DC, the very sort of bland, um, watered down, tightened up style of what they forced people like Carmen Infantino to do with their panel work. Imagine if readers at the time were seeing Neal Adams' work in 1960 and 1961 and 1962. I think you might have a situation where some of the stuff that Kirby and Ditko are doing is going to look blocky and clumsy almost in comparison to Neal Adams on the fly. I think we're also going to see a similar thing happening over at DC. Now, in the real world, DC loosened up their style in a large part because of Neal Adams. When Carmen Infantino took over as the art director in 1967, that's when he brought in Neal Adams, and Neal Adams became his #1 cover guy, and pretty much within a couple years had revolutionized the look of DC Comics thanks to that combination, right? But if DC doesn't have that, and in 1962, when we still have the old guard in place, they're having to react to Neal Adams's art at Archie Comics, I think you're going to see DC having to react much earlier, loosen up their style much earlier. Think you're going to see artists that are at DC at that time be allowed a lot more dynamism. People like Gil Kane and Carmen Infantino. But there's other people working in the early 60s, pre-Marvel work, like John Romita and Gene Colan and artists like that who are forced to do this buttoned-up style. And they're mostly in romance books. But we saw how they were able to thrive over at Marvel when they're allowed a broader canvas. Imagine DC doing that in 62 and 63 and just allowing their artists a much greater flow. I think what you would see is... I think you'd still see DC as the big company. I think Marvel's impact would be smaller. I think Archie's impact would be much bigger, and the influence would be very different though with Neal Adams, because instead of an impact on the industry in terms of the sales and the characters that Jack Kirby's creating at Marvel when he left Archie, with Neal Adams, what you're going to see is his influence on the artists at other companies. So I don't think that the Fly itself or Archie itself is going to like take over the industry or anything like it might have done if Kirby had been in charge. But what I think you're going to see is you're going to see the Fly become really popular because of this revolutionary art style. You're going to see Archie have a longer influence in terms of they're going to have still, I think, only a few series, though, just basically the ones with Neal Adams working on them, but they're going to last much longer, be much more popular. But his style is going to influence how the comics are drawn at DC, how the comics are drawn at Marvel. I think Marvel, instead of setting the standard for superhero comics with Kirby, they're going to have to start reacting to Neal Adams immediately when they're first putting out their original books. I wonder where Steve Ditko is going to fall. I think Ditko's work, if it's in direct comparison to Neal Adams at the same time, I don't think that works. I think we're going to see maybe Ditko doesn't take off at Marvel. Maybe we end up with someone else being assigned to do the Spider-Man book instead of Ditko. And Ditko goes over to Charlton earlier because his talents don't really fit in anymore with the prevailing art style. So I think there is a different kind of trickle-down effect if Neal Adams stays at Archie and develops his style earlier. I think we see comics sort of grow up visually much sooner, and I think the stuff that we see visually in terms of books in the 70s, we might see that stuff in 64 or 65. And I think Marvel's smaller. I think Marvel is more reactive. I think DC loosens up much earlier, and I almost think that having Neal Adams pushing them from outside in the way that Marvel pushes them from outside ends up allowing DC to forcing and allowing DC to change their style much earlier and maybe actually stay top dog instead of Marvel, with the addition of Archie as a strong third company, not with not as many titles, not in much popularity, but it's a third consistent, steady selling line of superhero books to complement both of those other companies. So, what do you guys think? What do you think would be? I mean, I don't think that Neal Adams staying at Archie to do Archie Comics like he actually did in 1960 makes any sense. It's a total waste of his talent, and I'm glad he didn't stay. We're doing Archie's Joke Book, which is one of the dumbest titles ever put out. But what would you think? What do you think might have happened with The Fly and the Archie line, the Archie Adventure series line of superhero books, if Neal Adams had stayed there, and how would that have affected everything? Let me know what you think. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and I'll see you next time.